Please be seated. Brigadier Carlos Lovell, Chief of Staff, Barbados Defense Force. Captain Naval Mark Peterson, Deputy Chief of Staff, Barbados Defense Force. Lieutenant Colonel Atheline Branch, former Deputy Chief of Staff, and today's guest lecturer, Lieutenant Colonel Florence Giddings, today's feature guest. Lieutenant Colonel Julia Dabrio, Commanding Officer of the Barbados Regiment. Lieutenant Commander Graham Rochford, Commanding Officer, Acting Barbados Coast Guard. The Reverend Hugh Sandiford, Force Senior Chaplain. Master Chief Petty Officer 1 Austin Howell, Force Sergeant Major. Officers, both serving and retired. Warrant officers, enlisted ranks, both serving and retired. Specially invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I am Lieutenant Tevin Maynard, and your master ceremonies for this evening's proceedings. I'm sure I look a little bit strange here, but I would like to bring excuse on behalf of Lieutenant Coast Guard Crispin Hackett, as he isn't well. Keep it in your purse, please. It gives me great pleasure to be here this evening for the final lecture of the lecture series in commemoration of the 45th anniversary of the Barbados Defense Force. Today's lecture promises to be interesting as we focus on the topic, Women in Combats, the Barbados Defense Force Experience. At this time, I would like to give thanks as we invite our Force Chaplain, Reverend Hugh Sandiford, to move us in prayer.
Good evening, would you please stand? Let us pray. Blessed, hallowed, praise and thanksgiving be unto you, O Lord, on this, the occasion of the 45th anniversary of the Barbados Defense Force. We thank you especially for the females whose participation would have predated the 45 years, commencing in 1974. Pray, dear Lord, that as we reflect upon their experience, that we may gain some insights helping as we move forward. Be with us now this evening in all that we shall say and do here, and may be pleasing unto thy sight. All these things we ask through Christ our Lord. Amen. You may be seated.
Thank you, Reverend Sandiford. On behalf of the Chief of Staff, Barbados Defense Force, I would like to welcome you all here this evening as we conclude the four-part lecture series of the Barbados Defense Force 45th anniversary celebration. I dare say I cannot think of any more fitting topic for this evening's lecture as we close our 45th anniversary. I also find it quite fitting that we invite two stalwarts of female service to the Barbados Defense Force who have helped in shaping the Barbados Defense Force into what it is today. So ladies and gentlemen, I again welcome to this final lecture of the four-part lecture series, and do enjoy the lecture. At this time, I would like to invite one of our very own female officers, Lieutenant Sarah Hippolyte, to introduce our featured lecture this evening.
Brigadier Carlos Lovell, Chief of Staff, Barbados Defense Force. Captain Naval Mark Peterson, Deputy Chief of Staff, Barbados Defense Force. Lieutenant Colonel Florence Giddings. Honored guests, Lieutenant Colonel Atheline Branch, today's featured guest speaker. Lieutenant Colonel Julia Dabrio, Commanding Officer of the Barbados Regiment. Lieutenant Commander Graham Rochford, Commanding Officer Acting Barbados Coast Guard. the Reverend Captain Hugh Sandiford, Master Chief Petty Officer 1, Austin Howell, 4 Sergeant Major, Barbados Defense Force, officers both serving and retired, warrant officers, enlisted ranks, both serving and retired. Other specially invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I am Lieutenant Sarah Hippolyte, Staff Officer, Human Resources. Welcome to this evening's final lecture, culminating the Barbados Defense Force 45th Anniversary Lecture Series, to be delivered by Lieutenant Colonel Atheline Branch. The lecture is entitled Women in Combats, examining the challenges and contributions of the Barbados Defense Force Service women to the development of the force and the wider security apparatus. This presentation is timely and relevant, given the evolving role of women in military context globally, and in the context of women, peace, and security concept, it will provide a critical examination of the evolving role of women in military settings, especially as it relates to the Barbados Defense Force. It also highlights both the challenges faced by service women and their significant contributions to our national security dynamics. Join me as I formally welcome Lieutenant Colonel Atheline Branch and her contributions made in support of the force's development, aptly emphasizing her suitability to speak on today's topic. Lieutenant Colonel Branch joined the Barbados Regiment in 1978 and the Barbados Defense Force in June of 1980. Lieutenant Colonel Branch started her regular career as a private and was quickly recommended for a commission after 9 months. She was appointed a midshipman in the Barbados Coast Guard before proceeding on training. She completed her officer's training at the Women's Royal Army College, Sandhurst, United Kingdom. She has served in numerous positions in the Barbados Defense Force, including Admin Officer of the Barbados Coast Guard, Assistant Staff Officer Logistics, Quartermaster, and Adjutant. Lieutenant Colonel Branch became the first female officer to be appointed aide-de-camp to the Governor General, where she worked from 1990 to 1995. She completed Staff Officer College in Kingston, Canada in 1998, and on returning was appointed the officer commanding Combat and Administrative Support Squadron from 1998 to 2000. In 2001, she was appointed second in command of Services and Support Battalion and was the acting commanding officer of the battalion from 2002 to 2003. In 2004, Lieutenant Colonel Branch was selected to be the defense attaché in the Embassy of Barbados in Washington, D.C., United States of America, and the chief of delegation at the Inter-American Defense Board, and the alternate representative to the Organization of American States, where she served until 2009. On her return, she was appointed as commanding officer, Barbados Regiment, which is a land forces element of the Barbados Defense Force. Lieutenant Colonel Branch acted as Deputy Chief of Staff of the Barbados Defense Force from April of 2010 and was appointed to that position in October of 2010. She retired from regular service in June of 2013 and from the reservists in November of 2020. During the COVID-19 pandemic, she was requested to set up and head the Quarantine Engagement Unit in the Ministry of Health and Wellness in December of 2020, where she had the responsibility of ensuring that all persons entering the island adhere to the quarantine rules and restrictions. This unit functioned until all the protocols were discontinued in June of 2022. Lieutenant Colonel Branch has been awarded the Gold Award of Achievement, member of the British Empire Medal, Service Medal of Honor, General Service Medal, Queen's Jubilee Medal, and the Defense Board Commendation. She has a Bachelor of Arts in History and Sociology and a Master's in Public Administration. Lieutenant Colonel Branch is presently a commissioner on the Protective Services Commission, a member of the St. John's Ambulance Council, chairman of the Barbados Legion Council, and president of the Girl Guides Association of Barbados. She is also a member of the Boxing Association Disciplinary Committee, and she is also a church school teacher at the Youth One class at the Bethel Methodist Church. Today, Lieutenant Colonel Branch will be joined by Lieutenant Colonel Florence Gittins after the lecture to facilitate what I believe will be a stimulating panel discussion on women in combats. I again welcome Lieutenant Colonel Branch.
Good evening to all. Chief of Staff, Brigadier Carlos Lovell, Deputy Chief of Staff, Captain Naval Mark Peterson, Lieutenant Colonel Florence Gittins, Commanding Officer of the Barbados Regiment, Lieutenant Colonel Julia Dabrio, Acting Commanding Officer of the Barbados Coast Guard, Lieutenant Commander Graham Rochford, First Chaplain, Captain the Reverend Sandyford, 4-Star Major, Master Chief, Petty Officer, Class 1, Howell, officers, warrant officers, senior rates, and members of the Barbados Defense Force, ladies and gentlemen. I want to take this opportunity first to thank those individuals who assisted me in the research of this lecture. Mrs. Jackie Gittins, Sergeant Glenda Yard, Sergeant Pat Marshall, Warrant Officer Ricardo Harrison, who has done his thesis at the UWI on the rise and role of women in the BDF, Ms. Margot Hoyt, Commander Curtin, and Mr. Vermont Connell. On the 17th of March, 1974, the first woman, Lieutenant Colonel Florence Gittins, joined the Barbados Regiment, followed by 15 others in April of 1974. And they can be considered as pioneers in this field, who paved the way for others to follow, all of y'all sitting here. Of those 16 women, 15 of them passed out in July 1974. They, of course, met obstacles, some of which they overcame. Others are still being faced by women in the BDF today, but to a far lesser extent. A fact that you may not know, the Guyana Defense Force is the only other defense force in the region to have had female members before Barbados. I will put up a slide with the names of those 15 women, if it would work. Somebody want to help me here with the technology? Right, got it. Thank you. Some of these names you will recognize, others you will not. Some you may not have realized were among those first women. Unfortunately, 4 of them are now deceased. You have Florence Gittins, Prestine Sobers, who's now deceased, Margot Sobers, Cynthia Brathwaite, Lydia Brathwaite, now deceased, Anna Harvey, Jacqueline Bess, Arlette Trotman, Pat Marshall. How many of y'all knew that Pat Marshall was one of the original females? Who stayed the course all the way through? Lieutenant Colonel Florence Gittins and Pat Marshall. Clotel Denny, Judy Marville, Yvonne Williams, Jennifer Brathwaite, Maureen Rochester, and Elita Butcher, who's now deceased as well. The regiment at this time was part-time. Sergeant Marshall remembers that on their first national parade, there were attempts to fondle them to ascertain whether they were actually women. She remembers that they were not really treated differently from their male colleagues, but adjustments had to be made in terms of the living accommodation and bathroom facilities. Is it working? I'm just going to put up a few pictures. You will find that the pictures I have are the dated pictures more so than the more recent ones, so that you will see how they were dressed and some of the things that they had to do. Now, this is one where I think we have Margot here who's fixing bayonets. We have here, let's see if I can see. This is Lillian Brathwaite, who was deceased. And you would also recognize deceased Victor Bavell and Williams, who is there on the right-hand side. And here is a clipping, Women Parade Breakthrough in 1974, the first time you ever had women on parade. Please note the shoes that they used to wear, the heels that they used to wear back then. Everybody had a good look? And here we have them on parade. I think you would see here, if I would just step across, here is Christine Sober. I believe they are not as Pat Marshall. During the initial years in the part-time regiment, women were given duties in support roles such as truck drivers and did guard duty and fire picket. But as the BDF evolved, they were placed in stereotypical roles, which I will expand on in the challenges. As Lieutenant Colonel Gittins has said, you had to work twice as hard as the men to gain the respect of your male peers. It was also mentioned that females had to be twice the citizen and twice the soldier, and let me explain. Because since they were part-time, in the first instance, they had to compete with their civilian jobs. And then secondly, as soldiers competing against their male counterparts when they came for training. With the establishment of the Barbados Defense Force in 1979, some of these women transferred to the regular element, while others transferred into the reserve element of the new force. Originally, the women comprised a separate unit known as the Corps of Women. And this was commanded by the then Lieutenant Florence Gittins. As a unit, all females came under the primary control of the most senior female officer for all administrative and disciplinary problems. This unit remained a separate unit until 1983, when it was integrated into the administrative squadron. Here we see some of them at work. I think you can recognize who was on the truck. Correct. Let's move on to speak a little bit about the challenges. The initial resentment from the men of having women come into their domain was the original challenge. Margot Hoyt reflected on what drove her to succeed, and it was the comment from the men, "We only come to mash up them things." This attitude was also stated by Vermont Connell, who was in the regiment when they first joined. He remembers that things were really stacked against the females, and they had to struggle to break through. It was thought that the women would have an easy time and given breaks from those that were senior. This did not happen. I'm sure Lieutenant Colonel Gittins later on will tell you that. He went on to state that if you manage both men and women, there was not much difference. If they are given the opportunity, they would succeed, and it was actually the men who perceived that they would not be able to do the task and therefore kept them back. The women of that era have told me that training was rough and that you were not spared because you were a female. There was inequality in the job opportunities and in the training in the early years. It was not until the late 1980s that there was some improvement in this area. Thankfully, it is far better today. When I joined, the prevailing attitude at the time, in a very male-dominant force, more so than now, was to relegate the women to certain jobs and to consider them as problems, which was created in the male's mind. The jobs open to women were clerks, medics, cooks, signalers, storewomen, mess stewards, and military police duties for the handling of female wrongdoers. The recruiting of females was haphazard in the 80s and was only addressed when the numbers dwindled to such a degree that there was no choice but to recruit. Over the years, females went through a variety of recruit training sessions. Some came in as pioneers along with men working in jobs before going through recruiting, and then only did a 2-week recruiting session while the men were sent to Paragon for training. And this, of course, led to some disciplinary problems. For the females, their training was sadly lacking. In the recruiting batch of 1984, they were allowed to do half the training, while for the other half, they were taught clerical skills. This picture shows some of the females going through some ribbon during recruit training. While the force was advertising that females did the same training as men, this was not initially practiced. To some extent, in the level of training, when the BDF came into being, the women were relegated backwards compared to the regiment days. From 1979 to 1990, you had about 200 females pass through the BDF, and only about a dozen had the privilege of being sent on overseas training. If a statistical comparison was made, females were given the lowest priority when it came to training. In pursuing higher studies at university, you were told that you had to leave the full-time and go to the reserve and hope that you would be able to return. For those who were the sole supporter in their household, this was not viable, and they did not pursue the higher education. This policy, as Lieutenant Anthony at the time would attest to, was only applied to women. There is nothing more distressing than being told that you cannot do something just because you're born female. The thinking in the BDF did not even reflect what was happening in the wider society to allow for the advancement of women. It is only persons who have experienced oppression in their societies that can relate to such a feeling. In the officers' mess, there was the archaic custom for the spouses to retire after dinner to another room, and the officers stayed behind to tell jokes. What was ironic is that although the custom for the officers to remain in the dining room, the female officers were relegated to leaving the room as well. So you had male officers stay behind, and female officers had to walk out with the wives. And this is a picture of what we had to wear as a mess kit. A white dress with a sash. So think of what you're wearing today. Another example. Have a good look at this picture. And you will see that the females are bearing arms. But guess what? The officers were not allowed to carry swords on parade. And they were told it is not tradition. Sexual harassment was an ongoing problem. The men did not take the women seriously, but considered females as playthings, dropping remarks, innuendos, and the subtle touching. It was very degrading. females developed a mechanism to deal with it. You also have to remember that at this time, there was no legislation in Barbados that dealt with sexual harassment either. So to deal with this, they sidestepped the advances, or they would laugh them off. Unfortunately, not all were able to do this or did not want to do this. And it caused problems in some cases with respect to discipline, with expectation of having transgressions overlooked. In the military, we spend an inordinate amount of time with each other. Relationships will happen. How to manage them is very important, and the onus is on the senior person to set the tone. If not, you will always have disrespect and a breakdown in discipline. Unfortunately, for the majority of cases, it is the female that ends up suffering in their career, while the men go on to be promoted. And I have lived through this, I have seen this. The bottom line is that females are held to a higher moral standard than the men. Promotion was slower for women back then, leading to slower career development. There was a less urgent approach to courses and training. The prevailing thought that the woman should not be in charge at certain levels persevered. Let's have a look at the policy when it comes to marriage. The policy was that when two soldiers are proposing to get married, one of them had to resign. And once again, in the majority of cases, it ended up being the female giving up her military career. There was also the attitude that women were the main caregivers for children. And at one point, it was stated that a woman could only have 2 children and be allowed to stay in the force. Women have been disadvantaged in terms of the number of children they may have while on active duty. You may not be able to see this clearly, but I will speak to it. There was a defense force, I don't know if it's still in force, Instruction 188, Policy on Grant of Maternity Leave and Pay within the BDF. Paragraph 3 states, females who joined before 1985 are eligible to return to work should they wish to do so after the birth of the child. And it goes on to stipulate their terms of payment and the option to transfer to the reserve. Paragraph 4, females not entitled to return to work, those up to January 1988. The conditions affecting females who joined BDF on or after January 85 are that they must not give birth to a child during the first 3 years of service if they wish to continue to serve. They may, after 3 years of service in the BDF, be entitled to have 1 child. The second after 5 years of service. Any female in this category who gives birth within the 3-year period is to be discharged or transferred to the reserve on the date the child is born. Why did this occur? It was thought that the BDF lost the benefit of the female soldier due to the time away for maternity leave. Please note, there is no similar restriction placed on a male soldier. We lost some very good soldiers because of that policy. I don't know if the force is eventually going to have paternity leave. I don't know if they're thinking of it, or you have it, no? So hopefully, I don't know if you will then turn around and put restrictions on the men so that they will not be away for too many times. Let's look at the contributions of the women in the BDF. The women in the BDF are an inspiration to both women and men in the society. They have dared to enter into a man's world and have succeeded. One of the most tangible ways of seeing this recognition is when the Corps of Women go on parade, and the comments you hear as they march past makes one feel very proud. I'll show you a couple of slides. This would obviously be an Independence Parade. And here we have a mixture where you can definitely tell that they're all female. And this one is from the 21st anniversary of the BDF, where they had the Grand Spectacular. And this was what the women wore for that spectacular. The first impact the females had on the force was the increased competitiveness, which brought up the overall standards of the BDF. What you had was a situation of the women needing to prove themselves to be just as good or better than the men, and therefore the men not wanting to be beaten by the women. So that brought up all the standards within the force. This is Betty Springer, and I believe Stephanie Proverbs. Betty now lives in the US, and Stephanie went on to be a head teacher at a primary school. So women generally joined with a higher academic level than the males, and this obviously, as I said, contributed to the development of the force. You know the old saying that an army marches on its stomach. Well, we had Sergeant Jacqueline Gittins, who kept the soldiers marching. Sergeant Gittins was in charge of the BDF kitchen for many years and ensured that nutritional meals were served. After leaving the force, she continued her contribution to wider society when she was made head of the school meals department. Here we have Sergeant Patricia Marshall. She followed in her footsteps in the catering field and remained in the BDF until her retirement in 2008. She is now in charge of the catering unit of the field medical hospital. We have Sergeant Arlette Trotman, who worked in the medical unit. She's immigrated to the USA and is now a hospital administrator. Colonel Gittins is saying she's now a doctor. Margot Hoyt, we had seen a picture of her earlier, was a dental officer and was part of the government scheme that went into schools. I still have another one there, to provide dental care to students in the 1970s, and she continued in that field. Judy Marvel was the first woman to be promoted, and her promotion came through the visit of President Gowan from Nigeria in 1975 to Barbados. Judy was chosen to present the bouquet to his wife. She so impressed the president that he leaned over and spoke to Colonel Banfield, and she was promoted. Sergeant Prestine Sobers. She was a legend, a match for any man. But more importantly, Sergeant Prestine Sobers started the cadet company at Ellerslie School, number 4 company, thereby opening the door for other schools to have companies and laying the groundwork for the expansion and transformation of the Barbados Cadet Corps. Here's a picture of me. I was the first female officer in the Coast Guard. I was not the first female. You had Andrea Leacock, and you had Hall, who were in the Coast Guard. It was the first female. And the next picture shows Hall raising the ensign for the commissioning of Willoughby Fort, and I'm standing behind her. The next slide shows Suzanne St. John and myself in our quarters, female quarters. And we would have been right after Colonel Gittins, we would have been the next two female officers. And here we have Lieutenant Commander Fernella Cordell. When she was on her final interview to be sent on her naval course, I was present. And the question was raised at that interview if we should be sending a female on a naval course. Her final interview before she traveled. She succeeded and became our first female ship's captain. Let's have a look at the contribution of the females in sports. In the early years, the women played netball. The BDF women had a netball team, and they participated in the Barbados Netball Association League with some success. This is the team in St. Lucia. We actually did an overseas tour in St. Lucia as well. I will continue to highlight some of the women who have been successful in the area of sport. This is just a few. We have CPO Sheldon Waldron. Who is the first female to reach the rank of Master Chief and has been the national women's champion in the indigenous sport of road tennis, I believe for a number of years now. Next, we have Kimberly Gittins as a boxer who achieved the Celtic Box Cup. She also participated in the CAC Games and the International Military Games and was part of the teams that achieved the bronze medal at both events. In 2023, last year, this national boxer took up the position as manager of the Barbados team that traveled to Guyana to participate in the Winfield Brathwaite Caribbean Schoolboys and Junior Boxing Tournament against other regional boxers. Lieutenant Sadie Seeley, hope I pronounced her name right, who was awarded a full athletic scholarship to Illinois State University in 2009. While there, she was undefeated in the 400 meters and was adjudged the most outstanding track athlete on 3 occasions and appointed track team captain in her senior year. There's more. She set records which I believe still stand, and her success was awarded by her being inducted into the Illinois State University Percy Family Hall of Fame in October 2021. Lieutenant Seeley also holds the Barbados national record as the fastest Barbadian female in the 800 and 1500 meter track events. I think we would all agree that the most prominent of the women is Lieutenant Colonel Florence Gittins. Who is known for her contribution in the medical field and the fact that she never seems to stop. Before joining the BDF, she worked in the area of anesthetics at the Old General Hospital. And when the QEH was built, she was instrumental in the setting up, opening, and the running of the recovery room, something that we take for granted today. She went on to be the principal tutor at the Tercentenary School of Nursing, and as stated by her contemporaries, made significant contribution to nursing education in Barbados. Lieutenant Colonel Gittins initiated and developed the medical unit, now known as the Florence Gittins Medical Center. It is through her that the BDF is able to look after the medical needs of the soldiers and the wider public with the introduction of the hyperbaric chamber, which has saved many lives from diving accidents and assisted the QEH with the management of patients who need critical care. Her latest achievement is seeing her idea of having a field medical hospital to assist the region during disasters come to fruition. Lastly but not least, let us turn our focus on the civilian support staff, of whom the majority are women. Miss Colleen Springer, Staff Officer Civilian, came to the BDF after assisting greatly from the government in the formation of the BDF itself, and continue to be a strategic link between the BDF and government. I don't know how many of you would also remember Miss Grace Edie, who for more than 30 years was the Chief of Staff Secretary and held many a secret. Both of these advised many officers and soldiers and assisted them in their careers. The civilian staff was expanded in the early 2000s to fill many of the administrative roles, hence freeing up the soldiers for other tasks. They are employed in the area of PBX office operators, cooks, clerical, and accounting staff. I am sure you wonder how we survived before they came. Although they are not in combats, the women of the civilian staff have seamlessly integrated into the life of soldiering. They continue to give human service, and like Ms. Springer and Ms. Edie, offer their advice to ensure that the force runs efficiently. It must be said that the turnover of the civilian staff is very low. And let us not forget that our first Commander-in-Chief of the BDF is our President, Her Excellency, the Most Honorable Dame Sandra Mason, a distinguished female of our country. In conclusion, females in the military are generally always seen in a positive light for their choice of career and have become widely accepted. They are considered as outstanding citizens who have dared to approach the unconventional. I want to say that females succeeded because of their determination and their efforts, but they would not have made the strides that they have done without the support of the men in the force. Let me make that clear. And that is essential to ensuring that the females continue to excel in all of their positions. I will end with a post that was placed on social media from the BDF for International Women's Day this year. The Chief of Staff and members of the Barbados Defense Force salute all women on this International Women's Day. In keeping with this year's theme, Invest in Women, Accelerate Progress, the BDF continues to champion the inclusion and empowerment of its female members. The force inspires inclusion with the knowledge that gender equality contributes to building a stronger society. As the force celebrates its 45th anniversary of establishment, investment in females and their success is celebrated as everyone's success. Since the establishment of the Barbados Defense Force in 1979, the presence and influence of females has grown and embody the force motto and symbol of excellence. Females serve in both operational and supporting roles, promoting justice, dignity, and the hope that women can continue to inspire each other. I felt very good when I read that, especially knowing where we had come from, to know that the Chief of Staff and the members of the Defense Force feel this way about the women in the force. I want to show you two last slides. And I think that this one is iconic. I don't think we will ever see this happen again. Three women behind three distinguished ladies acting as their ADCs. Iconic. I thank you.
What a fantastic lecture. I would like to invite everyone to stand as we give a round of applause for our guest speaker and Lieutenant Colonel Florence Giddings for the service that they have provided for the Barbados Defense Force over the years. Through the trials and tribulations, they have continued. Thank you. You may be seated. Mom, I just want to say that it probably was a long time coming. But I can attest to that post from the Instagram page of the Barbados Defense Force that where the rubber meets the road, the Barbados Defense Force is doing all that is necessary for the inclusion of women. And I dare say, Pargan is about to have its first female platoon commander, Lieutenant Branka White. We had its first female in the Rifleman, Private Crick. So the commanding officer of the Barbados Regiment is doing all that is necessary to make sure that we include women in all aspects of the force. At this time, we will now open the floor to questions. We invite Lieutenant Colonel Gittins and Lieutenant Colonel Branch to answer any questions anyone may have about the entire lecture or about the progress of women in the force.
Good evening, ma'am. Good evening, ma'am. We see that females are a strategic necessity where the force is concerned. And of note, we see that military see that women are more integrated along gender lines, and the Barbados Defense Force is no exception. You have highlighted milestones that have been reached as relates to representation, recognition, as well as the experience of women in the Barbados Defense Force. It is acknowledged that there is no policy that restricts any female or male from being posted anywhere within the Barbados Defense Force. Yet one of the challenges we see is underrepresentation. Ladies, I would like to know your views in terms of recommendation how we can approach the underrepresentation of women in the Barbados Defense Force.
Now, you're speaking in terms of the underrepresentation, in terms of the jobs that they do. what you have to realize is what was the thinking back in the day. And Colonel Gittins says she can speak to that.
Okay. Good evening, all. Is this on? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I come from the old days back in the Barbados Regiment before the Defence Force was formed. And when I was taken in on the 17th of March 1974 as the first woman to set up a medical unit, because I had been the principal tutor of the School of Nursing, and I left that and came in as a private to start the medical unit. The then commanding officer of the Barbados Regiment had this idea that women were not to do anything combat-wise. They were there. He said, "You will do the training of the men, but when push come to squeeze and the men are out doing their fighting and somebody attacks the headquarters, you may defend it, but you will not go out and attack." And that is why we had the first lot of women doing clerical and medical and things like that. When the unit that now houses the medical reception station was built, it was actually designed when we were still the Barbados Regiment before the Defence Force. And it was designed that the maximum number of females in the forthcoming Defence Force would be a platoon of 30, which is why the size of the building upstairs is supposed to hold 30 women. This is where we have come from, okay? As Colonel Branch said, life then was sort of different. I mean, I enjoyed it. And we spent from 74 to 79 preparing for the Defence Force. And this thing was, the women are there to support the men. And there it started. It was only after the Defence Force was formed, and Colonel Banfield was the first Chief of Staff for the first year, and he retired, and the Brigadier, Colonel Lewis then became the first Defence Chief of Staff, that things started to change, but change in a strange way. The same thing of you couldn't get pregnant, or you couldn't, if you got pregnant, you had to leave, and things like that. But if a man had 5 children in a year, he didn't have to leave, okay? So there was this different thing. Yes, there is this construct of, but you're far better now than it was then. You have improved. I mean, okay, same thing. You're going to have a female platoon leader and a female rifleman. That was unheard of in 1974. It was unheard of in 1979. And it will take time, because that's the other thing. You had a picture up about the women carrying SMGs and the officer with no sword. I was instructed not to carry a sword. I was not to carry a sword. So when I went on parade, I had a cane. The women carried their SMGs, but the officers could not carry swords. I don't know, but I think we're improving. But you have to take things slowly, but we're getting faster. You're in charge now. You can make it get faster.
And even when I joined this, the same attitude persisted for a long time. I had a fight to be Coast Guard, for one. I wasn't allowed to wear ceremonial uniform of the Coast Guard either, if you can believe that. Even to get the cap that you see me wearing there, that was also a struggle. So it's things that we have overcome, and I'm very glad to see the progress that the women have made in the force. And I hope it continues, and that the females continue to carry that flag and do well.
Good night, ma'am. This question for both of you. Reference to mentorship and support, was there a mentor or support system that played a key role in your journey?
I will take this one. Of course, I had the example of Colonel Gittins, but I also think having to fight for all the little successes is what really made me a good soldier. I mean, in terms of being an officer and so on, the brigadier was there. The brigadier taught us a lot when it came to being an officer, how to behave, how to carry yourself, what he expected. But you had to fight for every little gain. And you also had to prove that the women were just as good. I remember, for instance, when it came to this matter of children, we had one female that came in. She was a pioneer, and she had 4 children. And at that time, he did not realize that she had 4 children. And when he found out, he said, "She has to go. She has to go." And I remember speaking and saying, and at that point it was, who's looking after the children? You know, there are 4 of them. Who's looking after them? And I said, if she's here working every single day, somebody has to be looking after them. She must have put things in place, and that is not a reason to let somebody go. He agreed and let her stay. And she ended up being the chief clerk of the Barbados Defense Force.
Good evening, ma'am. You highlighted some of the challenges faced by women within the Barbados Defense Force. To date, some of these challenges still persist. How do you recommend that we as a force hold the bull by the horns and honestly, strategically, and holistically address some of the matters such as sexual harassment, bullying, and even some of those MWR matters that would affect your family life, your family structure? How can we put certain measures in place that are relevant? And the important word here is that is relevant to today's culture, norms, and values, because sometimes we try to overlay things with a fix that was dated back in 1979 or 74. Not crying that down. They do have their you have to give Jack his jacket, but sometimes what we need to do is apply things that are relevant to the culture as it stands today. How would you recommend that we address those things?
I can remember the sexual, the one thing I do remember is back in the Barbados Regiment days, before the Defense Force, being on parade, and a young male officer comes along inspecting. And we had on, the same khaki shirts and thing, and he wanted to fiddle with the button on the thing. And he did. He fiddled and I couldn't do one dash thing about it. It was in the middle of a parade. I had just to stand up there and take it. I was vexed. And I let his friend know too. Yeah. But you're sometimes you just can't do anything. I mean, if you're not on parade and you're not in front of all these people, and you can't make a scene, you can't move, you can't do anything except stare at him. So it has happened to me early in the game.
What is important is that you must speak up. And it is through the female speaking up that we ended up with a sexual harassment policy. As opposed to when I spoke about the fact that, the females back in the day just dealt with it, there wasn't any legislation. The younger ones coming in were far more aware when it came to the legislation that had been enacted, and therefore did not tolerate some of the things that were happening. So in terms of being able to better things for yourself, you have to speak up. That is important. You have to make recommendations, practical recommendations, not recommendations to get out of this and to get out of that. Practical recommendations, bearing in mind that when it comes to the BDF, the job is first. And that is paramount, and that's something you must always remember. So you always put things in place for your family. Make sure that you can, if you're called out at a moment's notice, you're not coming and giving an excuse and saying, well, I got to do this and I got to do that. Always make sure that you are properly situated and speak up about the conditions.
Good night, ma'am. I just want to know about the pay, because I remember back in the day, civil servants, females were paid less than men. Was this the same in the Barbados Defence Force or the regiment back then?
No, from the early days, from the very first start of the regiment when I went in, we got the same salary as the men.
I will tell you that for me, when I first went in, I was not paid the same as the men. Colonel Geddes might have realized this. And I was told that I would get $100 every 2 weeks. And that's why I started at, until things regularized. But it was all about a situation about, you're not sure if the person can stay, and I got to see how they can work out and that kind of stuff. But eventually it worked itself out and everything was regularized.
Just as a matter of payment, when I came in and they were doing, I'm talking about coming to a parade pay was $1 a parade, and if you were an instructor, you got all of $1.40. So you gave up a lot to come up here for $1, and you didn't get, the $1 was supposed to cover your transport fee at the bus stop and to buy polish for your shoes. That's what it was for. The rest was voluntary.
Good night, ma'am.
Right.
As part of the 45th anniversary celebrations, I would have went to CBC to do a Morning Barbados show where myself and Sergeant Mears was asked, what advice would we give to persons asking to join the Barbados Defence Force? My question to you tonight, ma'am, both of you, ma'ams, is what advice would you give to young females looking to join the Barbados Defence Force, and how to make the Barbados Defence Force a career for them?
Well, I always used to tell the people, complete your education first. Nobody can take your education away from you. So complete your education and then come. Now, if you can do it, coming in the reserve and do it, that's fine. But do not give up your education. Do that first. Your education will stay with you. The Defence Force will outgrow, you will outgrow the Defence Force. Other than that, it is not a cushy job. it's a lot of hours, it's a lot of sweat and tears, and you know, don't expect to come in and just go on a parade and look glamorous. Okay? That's the last of the things. So be sure you want to do what you want to do. Now, if you've been a cadet, for example, you know what it's about. Okay? So I would encourage the cadets to come in because they have a head start on all the rest of them. But in my day, I did recruiting with the first group of men and women. We had a large recruit training of over 150 people, and I was, you know, we did all the usual things like battle inoculation and firing of mortars and throwing of grenades and all these things. So it was good fun, actually. You know, you either like it or you don't like it. If you don't like it, don't stay. If you like it, stay, because you'll go far.
The Barbados Defense Force is a way of life. It is not a job. It is a way of life. So when you come into the force, you must expect to be there for long hours, as Colonel Gittins said. If you come into the force and you're going to have a partner coming into the force or later on, make sure you tell your partner what to expect. Do not let them think that you're going to be home at 4 o'clock to cook dinner. It is not going to happen. In fact, you can tell him that you expect to come home and find the dinner. Hopefully, you can try. But no, on a serious note, you have to make sure that you put your house in order, that you realize that you're going to spend quite a bit of time in the force, that you are expected to have good morals. Like I said, the woman is held to a higher moral standard than the men. And I think Lieutenant Colonel Darby remembered when I had a chat with the women, and I said, always respect your body first. Because if you don't respect it, then the men will not respect you. So it is very important that you carry yourself well in the Defense Force, work hard, and do not look for any shortcuts.
Very good evening to all. It gives me great pleasure tonight to say a heartfelt thank you to Colonel Branch and Lieutenant Colonel Florence Gittins for what they've acquiesced to do for us here tonight. I think that the presentation was fantastic, and I believe as well that the question and answer segment benefits from the many, many years of experience of these outstanding women. I also want to say that I'm privileged this evening to be a part of history, and that history for the Barbados Defense Force this is the first time in the history of the Barbados Defense Force that we have present at a formal occasion 3 female lieutenant colonels in the room. And I can certainly say that this is the first time for me in my 26 years, and if there's anyone else here who can say that this very occasion occurred at any point in the history of the Barbados Defense Force, I challenge you to stand up and say so this evening. However, history in the making, and we're very, very thankful for you this evening. 2 very simple questions or opportunities to expound further. I trained in the United Kingdom, and while I was there, I was pleased to realize that the journey of our Barbados Defense Force, even though short by comparison to the UK Armed Forces, we have made some tremendous strides, particularly in the area of gender equality, recognizing that even though we were small in size, some of the milestones that we have achieved with regard to gender equality, the UK Army has yet to achieve, such as having, when we had our first female commanding officers, they were yet to have their first female chiefs of services. We have had deputy chiefs, female deputy chiefs of staff. They are yet to have vice chiefs of defense staff. And I was proud to be able to stand in certain forums and basically say the Barbados Defense Force has achieved these milestones and passed. One of the things, however, that they were able to discover early in the piece is that having women integrated into combat and operational units was that female officers and enlisted enhanced the operational capability of the UK Armed Forces. One of the examples is in Afghanistan, where they realized that the inclusion of female soldiers on operation, the female soldiers were able to gather more intelligence than the males because they were able to speak to the children, they were able to speak to the wives. Male soldiers were not allowed to do that. If they did that, then they would run afoul of the village elders and a whole host of other things. So that was one of the ways that the UK Armed Forces recognized that females integrated into combat and in operational units were able to enhance their capabilities. I'm wondering if you can share with us this evening any of the examples in our 45 years or even before the BDF of women being integrated in maybe not combat or kinetic roles, but integrated in operations that was able to improve the capacity of the Barbados Defense Force. And once you've answered that question, then I'll pose my second question.
I'm going to let Colonel Gittins, because I think one of the major roles that the women have played an important part is in disaster relief efforts.
Yeah, disaster relief has been my pet ever since I started as a nurse. And between 1976 actually, and 1995, I attended every disaster in the Caribbean, post-disaster. So I learned that concrete is a very comfortable bed. But yes, because I used to go in charge of the group. My first thing was the Cubana air crash. And then the next one was the Hurricane David in Dominica in 1979. And it was, it was me and a man, namely Carol Mapp, Major Carol Mapp, Captain Carol Mapp as we were then. And we worked in Dominica for 3 weeks with all the supplies coming in and things like that. So our first contribution in disaster relief was in Dominica in 1979. And our last one was in Luis in Antigua in 1995. But the women and the men worked together. We used to go up with parties of them, and we used to do all sorts of things. We loaded aircraft, we unloaded aircraft, we cleared roads, we tended, well, we didn't have a medical unit, but you had a little first aid kit in your bag, and you did a few plasters on, and everything that needed to be done. If it was needed one of these chainsaws. Chainsaws are wonderful. Yeah, they could get you through lots of stuff. So everything that a man could do, we did. Because there wasn't anybody else to do it. So you just got on with it. And you worked from morning till night. You stopped at night because there was no light. And sometimes there was no water. I can remember in Melville Hall, there was people there and toilets, but nothing to flush them, nothing to drink, no food. But that's what makes you strong. You learn. Next time you ain't going to go without your biscuits and things. Okay? So yes, we have done a lot of disaster preparedness. And my wish, as Colonel Branch had said, was to have a medical unit. So we're almost at type 2 classification, and I would like to see that before I go that.
Well, just to follow on, I think that the females bring a different perspective and come up with different solutions that are sometimes well overlooked. I have to say that from my time working as ADC, I had the privilege of working with Dame Nita Barrow, who really championed female rights. And that opened up a new perspective for me in terms of how you need to fight for female rights. You know, I became branded as a feminist. You're always talking about the, you know, making sure that the females get this, the females get that. But it is actually a right that should be recognized. And it is something that you have to make sure that your male counterparts realize that the females are actually making a contribution in that particular area from a different perspective than how a male might view certain problems.
Thank you very much for those answers. The other question I wanted to pose is, you mentioned that, ma'am, that very interesting anecdote that you give regarding being inspected by a male officer and, you know, unwanted contact. Ma'am, you actually started to answer my second question. I was about to ask if there are any defining moments in the history of the Barbados Defense Force or any particular individuals who championed, challenged, or spoke truth to power with regard to female rights, female equality in the Barbados Defense Force that signaled a turning point in the way that women were integrated and treated within the Barbados Defense Force across the 45 years of our existence.
I would say that in terms of the turning points, it was having to fight for your rights and watching people change their perspective. You know, the fact that you would challenge certain thinking and then seeing them come around to that way of how, you know, females should be treated. I think that was one of the highlights of my career, to watch that happen. The fact that, you know, as I said, to see Lieutenant Cardell go off and be a full Coast Guard officer, that's one of the things I wanted to do. So when that couldn't happen, then I made sure, and I kept fighting to make sure that that could happen. You also had, I would have to say, when it came to the Chief of Staff, Colonel Quinton, he didn't discriminate in terms of the females and their posts, because it was through him that I became the CEO of BR. With Colonel Gittins, it would have been Brigadier Lewis. So that, you know, and I remember him saying to me, you know, that since I came back from the States, things have been easier for him when he took over the regiment. So it's those kind of remarks that make you feel good to know that you have achieved some degree of recognition in terms of working within the Barbados Defense Force.
I tried for some time to get we couldn't talk around me, but I tried them to get the higher up to change this thing of, if you're going to get married, one of you must leave. I didn't think that was a good thing. But I was only talking to men, and they were adamant that this was the right thing.
Good night again, Colonel Sergeant Morris. Where is the strength and diversity? How has being females influenced your perspective and approach to leadership since both of you all were commanding officers?
Okay, I was the first one. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't really have any problems, really. I mean, it's how you deal with people. You can have them do whatever you want if you do it the right way, you know? And a lot of the problems when you get this tussle, it's how the person is being treated. So I have to tell you that I was not aware of any major problems that concerned me when I was the commanding officer.
You remember that in the presentation I spoke to the fact that Colonel Gittins was the first OC of the Corps of Women. And that was a blessing at the time. It was a blessing because the women could come in front of her and cry, nor give a sad story or otherwise, which is what I have seen happen when they go before a male commanding officer. And that is being quite frank. They would go and they would give a sub-story or they will cry, and then, you know, the punishment comes down. With Colonel Gittins, that did not happen. The one good thing about it is that I learned from her. So whether you were male or female and you came before me, there was no difference whatsoever.
But they used to call me the smiling judge. I would listen carefully. The fellow would, yes, I mean, I would even tell them I sympathize with you, but I can't say that I agree with you. And he would rock back on his heels, and he says, right, I got her now. And I'd say 28 days detention.
I had a similar experience. A soldier came up to me a couple of years back. It's after I retired, and he said, you know, ma'am, you used to talk to us like if we were your son. You used to counsel us and everything. And then the hammer just used to come down. So you treat men and women equally at all times.
Yeah.
Ask question, ma'am. Good evening to the panel. My question will start at the end of Colonel Branch's response. Now, Colonel Giddens, you were one of many firsts, and perhaps you were the only white woman in the Army. How did that benefit or burden you?
Okay. I came up in Queen's College, and I was surrounded by all colors. And I never, ever thought I'm white among black. It never once occurred to me that I was any different. So people may have had problems with me, but I didn't have any with them. Because to me, I wasn't any different. But yes, there's times when it mattered not. I don't know if it was the color or if it was that I was a woman, but there are times when I know I was bypassed for other people because I think I was a woman. You know, we may get to find out why, but I'm not going to bring it up.
Just by the way, how many of y'all know that the females, okay, here?
Yeah.
That the females used to live in the iron barracks? Any of the new females knew that history?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, the females started out living upstairs of the iron barracks. And when the medical reception station was built, and the females then were housed upstairs, just to give you all a bit of history, if we ever had a disaster and that was turned into a full medical unit, the females are expected to go and live in tents, and upstairs becomes full hospital. Just so you all know, so if it does happen, you're not surprised.
Good evening, Colonels. Thank you very much for that thought-provoking and awe-inspiring lecture. And I would like to say, as the second earliest female, I think I'm the last of the 1980 females still being around. It is my dream and my hope, we've come a long way, that one day, in the not-too-distant future, we females will have the first female Chief of Staff of the Barbados Defense Force. Thank you.
I'm sure that day will come.
Yeah.
Ma'ams, I apologize for extending the night, but I realize that we've dealt with some very contentious topics during the course of the evening, and I believe in my capacity as Chief of Staff, it is my responsibility, I dare say my obligation, to ensure that we end the night on a positive note, on the right foot. So I'm going to pose the last question, where I'm going to ask each of you distinguished ladies, what would you recount as your crowning achievement in your careers in the Barbados Defense Force? That singular shining moment where you felt your proudest, and when you look back, you always look back with warm and fond memories. Thank you both.
To be honest with you, I don't know if I have a single one.
No.
I have quite a number of achievements. I think one of my best ones is obviously working with Dame Nita. And one of the reasons that stays with me is that when I first joined the Barbados Defense Force, which was an unconventional move, my mother did not speak with me for a year because she did not approve of me joining the Defense Force. But she came around eventually, and while I was working at Government House, she was able to be invited there, and I was able to see her smile proudly at me for having been there. And of course, another one would have been while I was stationed in Washington. At that time, working for the OAS, as a senior foreign service officer. And the RSS at that time was not well recognized. And as we would go to the meetings, and of course they would have these joint meetings where they would invite bodies, to attend the meetings. And I think it was myself and we had a Trinidadian who was there, and the Bahamian who was not military. And what we did was that we always spoke up, and when they would bring out the list of invitees for the conference or whatever, and we would note that the RSS was not invited, and we always speak up and say, look, the RSS is not there. And this happened a number of times. And then it came to the point where the RSS appeared on the list of OAS invitees for conferences.
Well, I don't think of anyone's outstanding thing. I was happy when the MRS got built and we opened that. I was happy when we got the chamber, and I have spent 1,600 odd hours in that chamber. I can remember one month, January 1989. I did not go home for the whole month. I had one day off, and I turned out that day I was a duty operations officer. But no, I mean, I can't say that I have any singular moment. I mean, I used to enjoy going to the disaster relief jaunts and work, but I don't think anything is outstanding, you know, that I can say, oh, whoa, yeah, no. Mm-mm. Sorry.
What it is that Colonel Gittins is an outstanding woman in so many areas that she can't give one.
I've always thought it's just another day and I'm just doing a job. I'm not doing anything special.
Lieutenant Colonel Branch, Lieutenant Colonel Gittins, again, I would like to thank you for such an amazing lecture and panel discussion. I'm sure that you opened the eyes of many of the females and certainly myself to the things that occurred in the past that have paved the way for what we have today in the Barbados Defense Force. At this time, I would like to invite Chief of Staff of the Barbados Defense Force, Brigadier Carlos Lovell, to present you with a small token for your contribution to our 45th anniversary celebrations. Sir. Thank you very much, sir. There's a old saying that our Chief of Staff likes to say to me after every lecture: the reward for good work is more work. But I'd like to tweak that a little bit and say the reward for good work is recognition. And there's two persons that I would like to recognize for their contribution to the lecture series from start to finish. Lieutenant Coast Guard Hackett, who couldn't be with us this evening. Lieutenant Coast Guard Hackett from the beginning jumped to assist me with the lecture series and did a fantastic job. I cannot fill his shoes, but we would like to wish him well. And the other person is Sergeant Rogers, who has, from the beginning of the lecture series, committed his assistance to providing the refreshments that we have every time we come here for the lecture series. and that you so enjoy. With a high level of professionalism, Sergeant Rogers has committed his time and efforts to this endeavor. I would now like to invite Commanding Officer of the Barbados Regiment to present him with a small token. Thank you very much, man. It would be remiss of me to continue without thanking the persons who would have assisted me with the lecture series. Lieutenant Rico Eiffel, Sub-Lieutenant Zane Kelman, Lieutenant Seeley, and Second Lieutenant Ford. We made up the committee for the 4-part lecture series, and those persons have assisted me throughout. There are others. Those are the persons that were the immediate assistants to the lecture series, and I would like to thank them publicly for the work that they would have put in over the past couple of months. I now invite Second Lieutenant Brittany Branker-White to move this evening's vote of thanks.
Chief of Staff, Brigadier Carlos Lovell, Deputy Chief of Staff, Captain Naval Mark Peterson, Guest Speaker, Lieutenant Colonel Retired Atheline Branch, Featured Guest, Lieutenant Colonel Retired Florence Gittings, Commanding Officer of the Barbados Regiment, Lieutenant Colonel Julia Dabrio, Commanding Officer of the Barbados Coast Guard, Acting Lieutenant Commander Graham Rochford, Force Senior Chaplain, the Reverend Hugh Sandiford, Force Sergeant Major, Master Chief Petty Officer Class 1, Austin Howell, officers, both serving and retired, warrant officers, enlisted ranks, both serving and retired, other specially invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I am Second Lieutenant Brittany Branker-White, and it is a great honor to be afforded the opportunity to move the vote of thanks for this evening's proceedings. Firstly, I wish to extend a heartfelt gratitude to our Lord and Savior for his continuous blessings upon us and for allowing us to have a successful lecture this evening. To Lieutenant Colonel Retired Atheline Branch and Lieutenant Colonel Retired Florence Gittings, on behalf of the Chief of Staff of the Barbados Defense Force, I wish to express how grateful we are that you graciously accepted our request to be our featured speaker and featured guest for this evening's lecture, and for certainly concluding the 4-part lecture series in the most fulfilling manner. Your words have been very inspirational for many in the crowd this evening, especially myself, as I may not be standing here today if not for your trailblazing endeavors within this organization. For these reasons, I thank you beyond where my words can extend. Sincere thanks are also extended to the Force Senior Chaplain, the Reverend Hugh Sandiford, for leading us in prayer and fostering in God's blessings. To the commanding officers of the Barbados Regiment and the Barbados Coast Guard, your unwavering support throughout this lecture series has not gone unnoticed, and I humbly extend my gratitude, as great things are never done by one person. They're done by a team of people. Lieutenant Sarah Hippolyte, a very special thank you for the time and effort you put in to introducing this evening's speakers. Lieutenant Tavin Maynard, who hastily accepted the role of the Master of Ceremonies this evening. I kindly thank you, sir. As for most of you, or as most of us would agree, Sergeant Rogers does deserve a very, very, very special thank you, as well as his team, for always concluding the night with a good bite. To the sponsors, staff, and all others who would have played a role in the making these events possible, On behalf of the 45th Anniversary Committee, I thank you for your unwavering assistance throughout these endeavors. Last, but by no means least, to our guests and audience this evening, we are indeed grateful and delightful to have hosted you here this evening and at all our anniversary events. The theme for the 45th anniversary of the Barbados Defense Force is Proven Excellence, Shaping a Promising Future. At year 45, we must not only encompass and display this excellence, but instill it in those coming after us. Our future is just as important as our excellence right now. We can only be excellent then if we train our subordinates not to be as good as us, but to be better than us now. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you.
That brings us to the end of this evening's proceedings and the 45th anniversary four-part lecture series. It was a pleasure having you here this evening and those who turned out for the previous lectures. We will now retire to the rear of the building for some light refreshments and mix and mingle. Feel free to enjoy more conversation with Lieutenant Colonel Atheline Branch and Lieutenant Colonel Giddings. Thank you and do have a wonderful night. I'll break it down for you.
You know what I got to do? No, it was on. I need to